Cleopatra VII was born around 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek Macedonian royal house that had ruled Egypt since the age of Alexander the Great. Alexandria, her home city, was a dazzling crossroads of trade and intellect, marble harbors, crowded markets, and scholars debating in a city that breathed ambition. But beneath the brilliance, the Ptolemaic court was a dangerous machine powered by rivalry. In Cleopatra's world, power was not inherited peacefully. It was defended, negotiated, and sometimes stolen. From childhood, she learned the central truth of her family. Anyone close enough to share the throne was close enough to threaten it. Egypt itself was wealthy yet exposed. The Nile's grain fed the Mediterranean, and that made Egypt valuable to a rising superpower, Rome. The Roman Republic was expanding aggressively, transforming independent kingdoms into client states. Egypt's freedom depended on political balance, careful diplomacy, and sometimes costly payments to Roman leaders. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, survived partly through bribery and Roman support, and his reign trained Cleopatra to see politics as a series of exchanges: money, loyalty, legitimacy, influence. But Cleopatra also understood something deeper than many of her ancestors. Egypt's people mattered. Unlike earlier Ptolemies who leaned heavily into Greek identity, Cleopatra learned the Egyptian language and embraced Egyptian religious symbolism. That was not a decorative choice, it was a strategy. A ruler who could speak to native Egyptians and appear as a legitimate pharaoh could build support beyond the palace faction fights. When Ptolemy XII died, Cleopatra was still very young, around 18, and the throne was left to her and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII as co-rulers. Co-rule sounded stable on paper, but in Ptolemaic history it was usually temporary. Cleopatra began asserting her authority quickly, using official documents and coin imagery to place herself at the center of government. That alarmed the advisors around Ptolemy XIII, especially those who feared losing their own influence if Cleopatra ruled independently. The result was a political strike. Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria and driven into exile. It could have ended her reign permanently. Instead, it triggered her most famous and most revealing move. At the same time, Rome was tearing itself apart. Julius Caesar and Pompey were locked in civil war, and Pompey fled to Egypt hoping to find support. Ptolemy XIII's court made a brutal gamble. They murdered Pompey upon arrival, believing Caesar would approve. Caesar did not. He came to Alexandria furious, demanding control over the Egyptian succession dispute. Cleopatra, blocked from the city, needed access to Caesar before her brother's faction sealed the outcome. She arranged a secret meeting, later dramatized as being smuggled and wrapped in linens or a carpet. Whether the packaging is legend or fact, the political meaning is clear. Cleopatra reached the decision-maker first, and she offered him something valuable: stability, cooperation, and resources under her leadership. Conflict erupted into the Alexandrian War. Alexandria became a battlefield with street fighting and naval clashes. In the end, Ptolemy XIII died during the chaos, and Cleopatra returned to power. Caesar's presence had shifted the balance, but Cleopatra was not simply placed on the throne like a decoration. She was building a shield for Egypt's independence, using Rome's internal rivalries as a tool. Soon after, she gave birth to a son known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. The child's existence was political dynamite. If Caesarion was acknowledged as Caesar's son, Cleopatra's legitimacy and leverage would multiply. She even traveled to Rome and observed the Roman elite up close: ambition, paranoia, and the fragile nature of power in a republic that was slowly becoming an empire. After Caesar's death, Rome's power settled into the hands of the Second Triumvirate: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Antony controlled the eastern territories, and that placed him closest to Egypt and closest to Cleopatra's future. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus. Cleopatra did not arrive like a frightened client pleading for mercy. She arrived like a monarch, staging diplomacy as theater. wealth, ceremony, symbolism, and absolute confidence. Ancient accounts describe perfumed sails and a dramatic entrance, and even if later writers embellished the details, the underlying strategy stands. Cleopatra understood Antony's temperament and used spectacle as persuasion. This was not romance first, it was leverage first. Cleopatra and Antony formed an alliance that became both political and personal. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and supply lines for his military ambitions, especially his campaigns in the east. Cleopatra needed Roman protection and a partner strong enough to keep Egypt from being swallowed by Rome's unstoppable expansion. Together, they built a vision of power centered on the eastern Mediterranean, with Egypt as the anchor and Antony's Roman authority as the sword. Cleopatra bore Antony children, and their household began to look like the core of a rival empire, an alternative to Rome's growing consolidation under Octavian. The boldest expression of that project was the donations of Alexandria. In a grand ceremony, Antony distributed titles and territories to Cleopatra and their children, elevating Cleopatra as Queen of Kings and recognizing Caesarion as Caesar's son. To Cleopatra, it was a declaration that the East could be reorganized under her dynasty, and that her family could stand as equals to Rome's rulers rather than subjects. But to Octavian, it was a propaganda gift. Octavian framed the donations as betrayal, a Roman general allegedly surrendering Roman power to a foreign queen. Cleopatra was portrayed not as a sovereign strategist, but as an exotic threat, an outsider supposedly controlling Antony. Octavian's messaging was ruthless and effective because it turned the coming conflict into something Rome could accept emotionally. It was no longer a Roman civil war, it was a war against an external enemy, with Cleopatra cast as the villain. The final confrontation arrived in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, a decisive naval clash off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Marcus Agrippa, faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Actium was more than a battle. It was a referendum on the future of the Mediterranean world. If Cleopatra and Antony won, an Eastern power bloc might dominate. If Octavian won, Rome would consolidate into a single controlling authority, an empire in all but name. The battle ended in defeat for Cleopatra and Antony. The exact sequence of decisions during the fight is still debated, but the outcome was unmistakable. Octavian gained momentum, and momentum in civil war becomes destiny. Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Egypt, and Octavian followed. In Alexandria, the walls closed in. Cleopatra attempted negotiation, searching for terms that might protect her children or preserve some fragment of her dynasty. Octavian had little reason to be generous. Cleopatra was too powerful as a symbol. Alive, she could be used as a trophy. Dead, she could be erased or rewritten. Antony's attempts to rally resistance failed. Allies abandoned him, and despair took hold. Believing Cleopatra dead due to false reports, Antony attempted suicide and was brought fatally wounded to Cleopatra. He died with his vision collapsing around him, his armies gone, his prestige shattered, his alliance with Cleopatra reduced to a final moment of grief. Now Cleopatra faced Octavian alone. Her fate was narrowing to a single choice: surrender and risk humiliation in Rome, or end her own story on her own terms. In 30 BCE, Cleopatra died, most famously said to be by the bite of an asp, though the exact method remains uncertain and may have involved poison. The method matters less than the meaning. Cleopatra refused to be paraded as someone else's triumph. Her death was the final act of control she could still claim. With Cleopatra gone, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt was annexed and transformed into a Roman province, becoming a personal source of wealth and grain for Octavian, who soon became Augustus, the first emperor. Caesarion was captured and killed, removing a living challenge to Octavian's legitimacy. Cleopatra's surviving children by Antony were taken to Rome, their lives redirected into the orbit of the victors. Egypt, once a kingdom that fed the world and commanded the Nile, became an asset of an empire. Cleopatra's legacy, however, did not die with her. The greatest distortion came afterwards. Her enemy's version of the story spread fastest. Octavian's propaganda painted her as a corrupting temptress rather than a calculating stateswoman, and later writers repeated variations of that image. But the deeper truth is more formidable. Cleopatra ruled in an era when Rome devoured nations, and she kept Egypt independent longer than most could have managed. She wielded language, religion, spectacle, money, and alliances as weapons. She understood that perception could move armies as surely as steel. Even her most theatrical moments were strategy, not vanity. She did not lose because she lacked intelligence. She lost because she faced an opponent with superior resources, superior command, and superior control of narrative.